So I see more and more attendees are joining. So I will wait a couple more seconds before we start with the session today. Thank you everybody for being here with us. All right, I think we are ready to start. So I would like to welcome everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you to this launching event today on best practice in laboratory policy development, guidance on sustainable laboratory infrastructure development. My name is Dorina and I will be leading you through the session today. The session will start with some opening remarks on behalf of UNIDO, the International Network on Quality Infrastructure, and the ILEC-IAF Joint Development Support Committee. We will then listen to a presentation on the key elements of the laboratory policy development and implementation guide before we engage in a panel discussion on the topic. As attendees, you're encouraged to post your questions in writing in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will select the questions and pose them to the panelists after the panel discussion. Considering that we will have some time limitations today, we might not be able to answer all the questions that we will receive. We want to apologize in advance if this is the case. We will also be taking full advantage of the used technology today. This session will be recorded and made available to everybody to review afterwards. The recordings of this session and all related material, as well as the publication that we're launching today, can be found on the UNIDO Knowledge Hub, hub.unido.org. Before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to know the audience a little bit better. So we have prepared a short question for you. Could you please indicate which stakeholder group best describes you? Are you from a government body or public sector? Are you for a national or regional QI institution? Are you coming from a laboratory? Or are you from an international organization, academia, or a small or medium-sized enterprise or any other private sector enterprise? Please enter your answers now. I see you're doing so. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to complete your entry. Thank you for engaging with us. It's interesting to know who is on the other side, not only the speakers. So I'll give you a couple more seconds because I see more and more people are entering their answers. And then I'm happy to show you the results in a minute. So, all right. We'll be ending the poll in 3 seconds, so be quick. All right. I'd like to share the results. Most of the attendees today are from national or regional QI institutions. Welcome to all of you. Welcome also to the representatives of laboratories, international organizations, government bodies, and last but not least, academia and SMEs. So welcome to everybody and thank you for being here with us today. Well, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speakers for the opening remarks, and we will start with Mr. Bernardo Sarmiento, Managing Director of Digitalization, Technology and Agribusiness at UNIDO. Bernardo, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thanks so much for attending. Welcome on behalf of UNIDO. A special thanks to INET-QI, special thanks to our donors, to Finland, to Switzerland. They have contributed to this work and they will contribute to the outreach of this important work that we are starting today. And special thanks to our speakers for their participation. Let me start by saying we have a long track record. UNIDO has a very long track record in supporting the establishment of laboratories or helping them to move towards accreditation. Over 1,000 laboratories have been supported, and we have for this done a very good mapping of the available services by the laboratories that are now permeated in something that we call LabNet. This is available tool for you. We have many tools that are available, and Going back to why we started this work, this is an outspring of our quality policy work, but we wanted to put an emphasis on looking at laboratories because we observed a fragmentation on the development of the laboratories. There is a multiplicity of institutions. There is no capacities for sustainability, sometimes unclear roles and responsibilities. There has been a supply-driven development and a mismatch between supply and demand. So this is why we think that it was very important to have these laboratory policies, which provides a framework of good governance. The policy can help policymakers are better addressed, and we can have the development of a more comprehensive and consistent and sustainable laboratory infrastructure in line with the private sector needs, but also directly impacting the development of the country. Quality infrastructure and laboratories must anticipate future developments. And also here we have been having a very pioneering role by drawing attention to the new technologies, Industry 4.0, but also to sustainability, how we bring in the circular economy. And we have to stimulate industrial development, ultimately coming from the UN, contributing to the SDGs. So I would like just to finalize saying that UNIDO is ready to support what comes next, the efforts in the future to build especially local experience, local expertise, and then see what happens from the field. And from this experience from the field, develop eventually other global public goods in close collaboration with our international technical partners. Thank you so much for this collaboration to INET-QI. Thank you. Back to you, Dorina.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for your opening remarks. And I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Xiao Jianhua, Chair of the International Network on Quality Infrastructure, for his opening statement. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Congratulations to the global launch of laboratory policy publication. Laboratory infrastructure is a key component of quality infrastructure. We know that quality infrastructure is a crucial element to promoting and sustaining economic development, as well as environmental and social well-being. And also then it relies on the metrology, standardization, accreditation, conformity assessment, and market surveillance. Laboratories are necessary for proving compliance and conformance. The competence and the impartiality of laboratories enable laboratories to generate valid results. Therefore, they are critical for the results to be relied upon by businesses, regulators, and consumers, and also used in other conformity assessments, such as inspection and certification. Metrology, standardization, and accreditation as a key institutional components in the quality infrastructure are important for building confidence on the competence and the impartiality of laboratories. A sustainable laboratory infrastructure, therefore, is essential for availability of competent and impartial laboratories to support effective operation of domestic markets. And its international recognition is important to establish its credibility in both local and foreign markets. So to achieve such a laboratory infrastructure, a laboratory policy is fundamental in order for all stakeholders to have a better understanding on current situation and also further improve the existing laboratory-related infrastructure. INET-QI is a partnership of relevant international organizations to work together to promote the development of quality infrastructure worldwide. UNIDO is playing a significant role in the development of policies in regard to quality infrastructure. This publication is indicative of UNIDO's and INET-QI's continued commitment for enhancing the quality infrastructure, contributing to the achievement of SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this statement. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Sharon May Shirley. She is the co-chair of the Joint Development Support Committee of the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation and the International Accreditation Forum, ILAC-IAF. Ms. Sharon May, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I speak from both sides of the laboratory accreditation divide with a deep appreciation for the constraints public and private sector labs face. I unreservedly register heartfelt thanks on behalf of the ILAC-IAF JDSC to UNIDO and INET-QI for this critical tool, laboratory policy, a guide to development and implementation, undoubtedly a global watershed moment. Today's launch is significant as laboratory services form the backbone of conformity assessment activities, pivotal to the success of quality infrastructure systems in developing economies. The LP guide will enable developing countries to leapfrog intrinsic hurdles in a free market environment, hurdles such as reliable test or measurement results from labs accredited by ILAC-MRA signatories. The challenges faced by economies with immature laboratory infrastructure are inter alia: unhealthy competition between public and private sector labs for both technical experts and market share, disproportionate application of duties, taxes to public and private sector labs, resulting in a wide disparity in pricing, unintended waste of scarce resources, duplication and fragmentation of lab services in the public sector, human capital constraints that lead to brain drain. A balanced national regional approach to lab design and operation will resolve procedural obstacles and realize wide-reaching positive outcomes, including legislative and regulatory frameworks that boost a competitive accreditation-based lab sector that supports both regulatory needs and a robust quality infrastructure. It also supports fair competition and sustainable public-private partnerships that enhance lab capacity and capability, rationalization and improvement of lab infrastructure to maximize our operations, provision of consistently accurate and needs-driven testing to safeguard consumer well-being and create much-needed global market access. Despite the interwoven nature of our societies, the progress made by each to attain resilient and sustainable economies vary. UNIDO understands well that developing countries are best positioned to realize desired outcomes to achieve their own strategic goals. In creating national or regional laboratory policies, countries must identify their unique priorities depending on geography, people, environment, and prosperity goals. The laboratory policy is a tool that is user-friendly and provides pragmatic pathways to create lab infrastructure needed to catalyze economic growth in developing countries. With that said, may I thank you. May God bless and grant success to this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon May, for this opening statement of yours. Before I give the floor now to Mike to present us the details of the guide in the publication today, I'd like to give the floor back to Bernardo for the launching. Bernardo?
Thank you very much. I only want to say I am very honored to do this, and very honored because this was a long journey and it was so nice journey to work together. This week I have been finding some pictures where we still were meeting physically. Last year around this time we were together in the first lockdown webinar, and today we're launching, and we have managed to do a lot of work. We know from the standard world, from the accreditation world, from metrology, we have been resilient, and also this is a proof of the resilience of QI. Thank you very much for doing this together. and we will work also together in the implementation. And with that, I declare this publication launched. And for all the participants, since it's a free publication, you will have it in the Knowledge Hub. So thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. We have herewith launched the publication, which is available on our Knowledge Hub, hub.unido.org. And for your easy convenience, we have put the link in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to give now the floor to Mike Peet, who will be presenting us the key elements of the publication on the guide on development and implementation of laboratory policy. Mike, please, the floor is yours and the presentation is coming.
Thank you, Dorina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. If I could move to the next slide, please, Dorina. Thank you. I think, as you've just heard from Bernardo, this has been a long time in development, and this is an auspicious occasion today. I certainly wouldn't try to go into any depth in a document that's taken over 2 years to develop, but hopefully we can have a helicopter trip through the document and you'll hear some of the highlights of that document. I would like to also, right at the beginning, just refer you all to page 7 of the document when you actually get your own copy of it, to see the many, many people that were involved in this process. And so it's an honor today just to speak on their behalf on this document. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Dorina. All we will cover really is why a laboratory policy, and we've already heard from our initial speakers some motivation of why a laboratory policy is required. How was it developed? What does it cover? Very important, policies are wonderful documents, but how should it be implemented? Because if we don't implement policy, then we really don't get very far. And then what would the challenges and benefits be of implementing such a policy? And then who should be involved in such a process? Thanks, Dorina. So why a laboratory policy? You've already heard inputs from our introductory speakers. Next slide, please, Dorina. That we have heard about the role of quality infrastructure and its critical element. And we know that many, many countries are working on their quality infrastructure in a more coordinated fashion by means of a quality policy. And we've also heard today from the chair of IQNet or INET-QI that laboratories are a key component of the quality infrastructure, not only for compliance of products, but also with regulations and conformity with market requirements. And there's always a need for strengthening and expansion to meet technical requirements and other challenges. And as we all know, strengthening a laboratory infrastructure is certainly not a trivial exercise because of the technicalities involved in the different areas of laboratories. Next slide, please, Dorina. So when we have seen that economies are trying to develop or strengthen their laboratory infrastructure, it usually occurs in an environment where there are many other pressing demands on the available public resources. And that could result in an unintended wastage of scarce resources because of replication of laboratory services, where similar testing capability is duplicated and other key areas that require attention are totally not addressed at all. And we've heard already in one of the opening remarks that you might even end up with these public laboratories actually competing not only with each other, but also with private sector laboratories to the detriment of everyone. And so, I mean, what was very evident in the 2 years of discussions in creating and developing this document, that investments in laboratory infrastructure should not only seek to address the immediate needs, but it's very important that they're channeled to areas where they can act as enablers and multipliers for longer term added value. And so this is really the approach that's being mooted now in this document through the use of a suitable and dedicated laboratory policy. And Bernardo has also mentioned the positive effect of such a process on the countries' contribution to sustainable development goals. You'll know there is a UNIDO document about QI and the SDGs, and laboratories are very evident throughout that document, and their role is extremely critical in achieving those goals in a sustainable way. Next slide, please. So what are the issues that indicate the need for laboratory policy? Well, it could be a growing concern for the safety of goods and services circulating in the domestic market, the need to increase the quality of domestic products for health and safety of citizens, also to meet international quality standards to either stay in or enter foreign markets. I think an appreciation from other role players that laboratories are playing an essential role in verifying national goods and services, comply with quality, safety, and sustainability requirements, and the need really to do that in a sustainable way. We've heard already about gaps in human talent, infrastructure. Everybody has got policies for market development. We all have regulatory frameworks, but a lot of these require the demonstration of technical capabilities of the tests that laboratories provide and the calibration and traceability that is inherent in that process. And so the lack of a policy to holistically and systematically address these weaknesses certainly is something that this policy is now aiming to address. Next slide, please. How was this developed? If we can move to the next slide. We've mentioned already that there is a strengthened partnership between UNIDO and INEC QI. I was involved in INEC QI when it first started as an idea nearly 20 years ago. So it's really, really encouraging to see this close relationship and this product of this relationship and previous ones as well. And it really has drawn on the wealth of experience and knowledge of the member countries and each of the organizations that are represented in INEC QI. The other thing that it does link to are the other UNIDO documents on quality policy, the 3 documents, and the document I mentioned earlier, Rebooting Quality Infrastructure for Sustainable Future. So all of these documents have guided the process, but also, of course, this document is very specific about the laboratory issues. And so the documents in total are all there to help quality infrastructure and laboratory infrastructure practitioners and policymakers to design and develop robust, holistic, and very important demand-driven quality and laboratory infrastructure systems. Just talking about the wealth and experience and knowledge of member countries and the broad consensus building process, I think it's very important to just amplify what Bernardo said. There were 2 expert group meetings in Vienna, one in December 2019 and one in January 2020 when we could still meet together. And that created an initial draft in April 2020, which went out for comment. And by August of last year, we'd received over 166 comments from 31 respondees representing 24 organizations. And I think we need to recognize that and thank them as well for the effort and time that was spent to provide those comments to really achieve this milestone today. Next slide, please. What does the document cover? So let's go through the next slide. And this was something I've learned something through this process that, it covers 3 areas, and we were focusing on the macro level, which is the policy level, and the guide identifies guiding principles for the formulation of a lab policy. It also addresses the meso or institutional level, where it looks at the elements required to enhance the trust in test and measurements data that laboratories provide, and of course the need for appropriate accreditation of these activities. And then it also addresses the micro level, the operational level, the common issues that have already mentioned by the laboratory committee, the development committee of ILAC chair, about these issues that laboratories face at the operational level. And all of this is expanded in great detail or more detail in page 34 and 35 of the document. If we then just start to highlight and drill down on the next slide, Dorina, that As a subcomponent of the quality policy, and given the work that was done on the policy and the time it took to arrive at the guiding principles within the quality policy, they were taken as the foundation in the work to then address policy principles for laboratories. And there were 5 principles that were identified, and the document really then drills down and goes through each of these different principles. So we have coherence from a laboratory perspective, integrity from a laboratory's perspective. Next slide, please. Inclusiveness, optimization, and sustainability. And all of these are expanded in the document from page 40 onwards, which really gives you then an understanding of where these policy principles are then customized for laboratory land. Next slide, please. Moving to the institutional level, we've already talked about what happens in the absence of a strategic vision and direction, where we have laboratory capability that's normally narrowly focused on meeting an immediate crisis, and it's not really looked at things in a holistic way. That these interventions are often over-dependent on donor assistance and kind of work while the donor is available and the assistance is required. But once that ends, then the interventions are frequently unsustainable, and we end up with equipment that's not maintained or even broken, and air conditioners that are not working, etc. And one thing that was very evident again in the discussions leading up to the development of the document was a need for a needs analysis of laboratory services before you launch into implementation. What is the context, the current stage of development of a particular country, its aspirations and strategies and goals for the future, and what could then assist the laboratories in making better informed investment decisions based on that, and not necessarily on the technical discussions of people and particular practitioners in the laboratories, but looking at a more holistic view of the environment. Next slide, please. It's of course very important that each economy determine its own priorities related to the development of the laboratory infrastructure, but also it's important to encourage appropriate relationships between public and private laboratories as well. And in the regulatory area, this is key, that there is a role for private laboratories in the regulatory area, but it needs an appropriate relationship, including trust. Also, strategic redundancy in available laboratory capacity can be used in mitigating risks and reduce downtime. The equipment that's used in one facility could be used to assist other laboratories if we're working in a collaborative and cooperative fashion. And yeah, where the private sector is involved in the protection of national interests, of course, we need necessary checks and balances about competence, impartiality, confidentiality. They must all be in place. And of course, accreditation is a great tool in that respect. Next slide, please. So here are some keys that come out at the institutional level. They have already been mentioned in the introductory remarks, and so I'm not going to dwell here because I am keeping an eye on the clock. So they are there, they're in the document, and so I'll move on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how should we implement this policy? And we're now moving to page 51 to page 53. Next slide, Dorina, please. And those of you that have memorized the quality policy document about the implementation, some of these things will be known to you, but it is focused now on the laboratory environment. And of course, we need to do the groundwork to ensure ownership, coordination within government and with the private sector. We need to do the strategic planning so that it will really sustainably address the strategic needs. Very important, which stakeholders need to be consulted during the consensus building process, because they will be very, very active, not only in developing the policy, but also making sure that it's then implemented successfully. And very important that there is the time to learn from others. And this is where the public goods provided by UNIDO are key, because there is opportunities on their platforms and others to learn from others, benchmark, and look at cost-effective solutions. Next slide, please. Then we draft the policy and build consensus, and that can be a fairly interactive and time-consuming activity. But even more so is the next stage of obtaining approval. And those of you that have been involved in policy approval know that this can be a very, very interesting and time-consuming activity. And it's very, very important that any sustained opposition has been identified and discussed and brought on board, because we certainly don't want it at this stage where we're presenting it to the government stakeholders to obtain approval for the document. Next slide, please. And then this is the key, and I was really pleased to hear Bernardo expressing the willingness of UNIDO to help to really implement these policies, that it's available to all citizens, and then we plan for implementation and make sure that it changes and adapts to changing circumstances and national priorities, as we've seen in the last year or so of this pandemic, that things can occur very, very rapidly and have very, very important challenges that we then face. And this is where the policy must be made fit for purpose and continually changed. Next slide, please. So what are some of the challenges and benefits that have been identified during the process of developing this policy document? At the regulatory and institutional level, the challenges are related to the regulatory framework that's applicable to laboratories. But with such a policy, then we have a framework that can encourage the use of both public and private sector laboratories under fair competition, so that when a person needs the tests, that they are available, there is no delay, and that the resources within a country or within a region are used to the maximum benefit for the user of the laboratories. That sometimes people have a challenge with articulating issues with regulators, but the policy helps develop and build communication channels between regulators and the laboratory infrastructure actors. And of course, the technical regulations and the challenges there are to ensure that the testing and measurement requirements and regulations are both appropriate and coherent, and we don't spend lots of trying to understand exactly what's required. And this is, you can find all of this on page 32 and 33 of the document. Next slide, please, Dorina. In the marketplace, there are challenges related to incentives and the information to develop appropriate markets for laboratory services. And this is very particular for the private sector. They really want to know that they'll get a return on their investment. So they really need to know, well, what are the broader picture before they will start to invest. The coverage of laboratory services is key as well. It should be fit for purpose and sustainable. And we need networking on an ongoing basis, that people realize that this is a collaborative effort. And then moving down to the technical area on the next slide and the laboratory level, please, Dorina. As already mentioned, human capital is key. We need people available, and we need them capable people, and we need them available when required on a continuous basis. So this starts to look at not only the people within the laboratory, but the processes of training, development, and even education prior to joining laboratories, that we have the technical expertise that's required to do this work on an ongoing basis, that we have the physical infrastructure and equipment, that the capability and capacity issues are addressed, and that of course that all of this can then demonstrate technical capabilities and competence in an impartial way. And this again is a nod to accreditation. Next slide, please, Dorina. So who should be involved in all of this process? And hopefully those countries that have already started on a quality policy will know that it's really the strength of the dialogue and cooperation with everyone concerned being involved on a continuous basis, that government has a leading role to enable, coordinate, and educate in the implementation of the policy. The private sector is encouraged to participate and even finance activities that support and promote further development and expansion of laboratories. That NGOs and civil societies are actively involved for the successful implementation of the policy. And the international QI community, as represented by the members of INEC QI and others, then can help the laboratory community understand and adapt to global trends. So I trust I'm within my 15 minutes, and I'd like to end with the last slide just to say thank you. And there is the link where you can really get a copy of this best-selling document, and I trust that you will enjoy it as much as we did in developing it for you. And with that, Dorina, I'd like to hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for this very interesting insight into the key elements of the document. Before we move to the panel discussion, I would like to remind everybody to please put your questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will try to address them after the panel discussion that we are about to start now. And for that, and without any further delay, I would like to hand the floor to Ms. Mary Malmquist, who will be moderating the panel discussion today. Mary is an international expert on quality infrastructure, TBT, accreditation and standards. We're very pleased to have her with us today. Mary, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, UNIDO, for even contemplating to ask me to do this. This publication is one of the latest additions to UNIDO's great library of publicly available intellectual property. Thank you, Mike Pete, for your leadership in this work, and thank you, UNIDO. It is now time for our panel to give their views on how the members of the organizations they represent can and will benefit from the laboratory policy documents. In particular, how this will help countries which are building their quality infrastructure do it right from the very start. Our first speaker on the panel is Ms. Cristina Dragici, who is Secretary of the ISO CASCO, the ISO Committee on Conformity Assessment. And to Cristina, to start her off, I would like to put the question, how will the laboratory policy document contribute to ISO's conformity assessment work and the development of standards? Cristina, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, UNIDO, for this event, bringing us together here to talk about the document that now is launched about laboratory policy development and implementation. So as Mary was saying, I'm the Secretary of the ISO Policy on Conformity Assessment, ISO CASCO. And we participated in the elaboration of this document, and we are happy to see it now published. So in my view, the laboratory policy could help create an environment where laboratories can perform and operate impartially, competently, so that trust in laboratory results is built and maintained. So as probably many of the participants today know, CASCO has two roles. Has a policy role in terms of policies and rules for conformity assessment, but also a role in developing standards for conformity assessment. And some of the standards that have been developed by CASCO, or standards that have been developed with CASCO support in a joint working group with other technical committees in ISO, they support directly the laboratories in terms of either implementing standards that help laboratory demonstrate competence and demonstrate that they can reliably provide results that are of good quality and they are valuable for their customers. Also, other standards that are more technical in nature that are used by the laboratory to perform their work. So one of the standards that is very much used and is the basis for accreditation of laboratories is the ISO IEC 17025, which deals with competence in calibration and testing laboratories. There are other standards, for instance, like ISO 15189, which is a standard for quality and competency in medical laboratories. And I think every one of us knows today how important that standard is in ensuring that the laboratory results on which treatments and medical decisions are based brings to the forefront the importance of standardization. So there are many other standards that have been created to help laboratories demonstrate their competency, help laboratories improve their operation, and offer framework for reliable results. So the way I see the laboratory policy is among the objectives that this policy could put forward would be, for instance, to ensure that relevant institutions are there to coordinate the development, dissemination, and promotion of standardization activities. Another element that the policy could promote is the access and the adoption or adaptation of international standards to the local context. We can also think that this policy may ensure the provision and access to relevant national and international standards, promote harmonization, facilitate international recognition, avoid duplication of efforts. And I think one of the previous speakers talked about the important role that the laboratory policy can play in avoiding duplication. And from the ISO-CASCO perspective, what is important for our work is that at the national level, at the institutional level, and the moment when this policy is adopted and implemented, there is consideration given to harmonization, to use of international standards, use of standards that have demonstrated that can promote good results and also international recognition. And I think one of the panelists will talk more about the role of a standard in achieving the international recognition of laboratories. So there are also trade implications, and if we ask ourselves why laboratory, why are we talking about laboratories, why UNIDO thought that the quality policy needs now to go further down and think about a policy for laboratories. So to this question, why, I think we all need to think about what a laboratory does. So the laboratory gives results, and on the basis of the results, decisions are taken. Decisions, approvals, regulatory approvals are taken based on laboratory results, and Shaw was mentioning earlier that laboratory results are a basis for other conformity assessment activities such as inspection or product certification. And we all know that many of the aims of a regulatory framework is based on preserving the health and safety of the population, also trying to encourage the economic development and the trade. So I think these are all good reasons why we support this idea of looking holistically of the quality infrastructure, looking holistically of the development of laboratory, and using the existing international standards to further develop the laboratory infrastructure. And one last thing that I would like to mention is that all these laboratories in a network of laboratories, their results are all contributing to the prosperity of a country, to supporting trade, and in the end, to supporting the 3 pillars of SDGs, people, prosperity, and planet. Thank you. Thank you,
Christina. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Mr. Andy Henson from BIPM. Director at the BIPM, and the BIPM, I'll have to pronounce this in French, unfortunately, Bureau International des Poids et Mesures. Was that correct, Andy?
That's perfect, yes. The International Bureau of Weights.
Okay, so my starting question to you is, how can a laboratory policy support metrology, and what benefits can national metrology institutes expect as a result thereof? And I think there's probably a lot to say about that. So
I'll try and keep it brief.
The word is yours, Andy. 5 minutes. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think of all the pillars of the quality infrastructure, perhaps the policy is really, really important in metrology. And particularly at NMI level, because if you're in a commercial lab, you're driven by the market. And as long as you can judge that market, well, you know what to do. But a national lab has to meet all of its national requirements, and that's not easy to fully understand, not at all. And so you need to look both outwards and inwards, and the policy really helps with this. Each country is very different, its economic activity, the blend of its economic activity, what's creating the wealth, how export-oriented it is, and in what commodities, what advanced manufacturing. Where's the dynamic? You know where you are today, but where you're going to be in 10 years' time. And having tried to understand that, you've got to try and work out how to add the value. It can be made particularly complicated because often the NMI will sit in a particular ministry, but it's got to serve the needs that are across the piece. So it might be in the Ministry of Industry, but it might also be supporting quality of life issues or regulatory issues, legal metrology and so on. Then inwards, the policy helps there as well. You have to focus resources, and they're always limited. Certainly limited in developing countries where they're just building their infrastructure, but actually they're also limited. They're never sufficient even in the advanced economies. So things like laboratory buildings, they're very specific, expensive and time-consuming to build. They have very particular requirements have to be maintained. Equipment, again, it can range from not so expensive to extremely expensive indeed. And of course, the human side. It takes a long time to make really good top-level metrologists, and you have to invest in this human capital. And you want to try and make sure that investment is the one that optimizes the situation in your country. And that's really, really not an easy thing to do. And having a policy, really, it gives you this opportunity to have the better physical and human resources, to improve the technical operation of the laboratory, and then to improve the interaction in the marketplace, and so that you're responding to the demand and perhaps anticipating tomorrow's demand as well. So this gives a sort of coherence to operating the lab and making the investments and deciding where you're going next, which is really, really pretty important. Of course, NMIs have a very particular requirement as well. They've got to demonstrate internationally that there is confidence in the measurements. So that's done through things like participation in the CIPM MRA. It may also be involving accreditation if you're also providing directly many services. So these things are really particularly important for NMIs. And the policy, how much blend are you going to operate PT schemes or not? Are you going to serve all the sectors? Are you going to have designated institutes to hold some of the national standards? Quite common, for example, for ionizing radiation or perhaps chemical metrology, or are you going to try and do it all in one laboratory? Clearly, this requires careful thought, it's major investments, it's time, and you've got to try and get it right. The other thing that's, in fact, one of the questions I saw in the Q&As come up is how often to look at the policy. Not an easy question, but it is important to understand that it is a dynamic situation. An optimal sort of blend today will not necessarily at all be the optimal blend in 10 years' time. So you do need to periodically come back and revisit where you're going with this. And the policy tools are really, really good tool for doing that. So I very, very strongly welcome the UNIDO initiative on this document, and we were very pleased to be able to contribute a little bit to this. So resources, equipment, buildings, people, and the external understanding of where to go, and also how to rely on others. Nobody can do everything themselves. Regional solutions, understanding you can't do everything and what you're not going to do, really, really important. Policy clearly helps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Now, the next panelist is Ms. Etty Feller, who is the chair of the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, ILAC. And Etty, before giving the word to you, I'd like to know how do you see that the laboratory policy document would have a positive influence on the ILAC MRA, which is very critical in increasing confidence in laboratories. And you have this goal of accredited ones accepted everywhere. What would the contribution be from such a document to those goals that you have? The word is yours, Etty.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank UNIDO and congrat for this project, and thank you for the invitation. As always, it's a great privilege to represent ILAC at the quality webinar, and especially in this situation. Everyone knows that quality play an essential role in our life. And especially I want to mention the past year that has taught us a lesson in modesty, in making the right choice, and the importance of testing in control of our life in general, in the medical area in principle. I don't want to say it again, but everyone is aware that there are 4 pillars in the system: metrology, standardization, accreditation, and all of them is to meet the market need, but by the end of the day, to meet the public needs, our needs. Mary mentioned the goal, but first I would like to say some words about the ILAC MRA. The ILAC MRA provides assurance that CABs in different economies are operating to the same international standard as was explained by Christina. Most of the labs around the world that are the ground to maintain and to implement regulations. And here I want to mention that there are national regulation, regional regulation, and some international regulation. The most popular one is 17025. But always we have to be aware that the surveillance of the market is done by labs, but have to follow also the technical standards around the world. So the accreditation, it's a process, it's a lively work, it's never ended story, but it's a process that for beginners, it gives a roadmap. It helped to prepare a gap analysis, and I think that this document will help countries, economies, governments, and regulators also to have their gap analysis, but in my opinion, most important to evaluate the risks that they are living in when they don't implement the LP. I want to talk about 2 impacts that I can see from my point of view. The LP, in my point of view, will have an impact in 2 layers. The short term, it's a new way of looking at lab work in an economy, and a new way of reviewing the process that is done in an economy. In the long term, I think that it will help also economies and especially regulators to write their regulation, to implement regulation that will help them to minimize the risks and to help them with all what was mentioned previously, import, exports, surveillance of the market, etc. There also an issue of small economies and how they can handle this needs or the accreditation. So we know already, and there are some experience of some countries that have decided to establish one AB for several countries, and this AB that serves several economies is part of the ILAC MRA. So there is a way, and we all have to be open-minded and to understand, especially after the last year, that we have to be open-minded and flexible. We have to be realistic on our way of work. And in my opinion, we will have not a new ways of work, but a new normal that will be a hybrid of remote, like this webinar, and face-to-face, and in all levels of work, including the accreditation system, we will have to be aware to these options. Finally, I think that this document brings on a document the links of all possibilities and allow mapping for each and every economy to get a clear picture of the situation in their economy and what are the steps that they have to do to achieve the goal. Those of you that are familiar with my work knows that my mission is to promote accreditation by qualified and competent organization in a harmonized way for the benefit of the world. And as Mary said, the ILAC goal is test one, accept everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Etty. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker and panelist is Mr. Javier Fernandez. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, who's a quality expert in, in the UNIDO Global Quality and Standards Program in Colombia. And he will give us a country perspective. And I'd like to, I know that while this document was being prepared, you were at the same time, I think, implementing a laboratory policy in Colombia. So what lessons have you learned? What can you give us as feedback? Please, the word is yours.
Okay, thank you, Maria, and greetings from UNIDO Field Office in Colombia to all panelists and audience. Okay, Colombia launched its quality policy in 2006, whose implementation established a solid base for the development of the laboratory policy. As a result of the quality policy of 2006, the National Accreditation Body of Colombia and the National Metrology Institute of Colombia were created and played a superlative role in the laboratory policy construction several years later. The construction process was fit from the quality infrastructure experience during those first years with the guidance of the National Planning Department. And for that reason, I consider that one of the main lessons is that a healthy and functional quality infrastructure can ease the process to draft a laboratory policy, and is worthy that developing countries invest in it. Also, it's extremely important to involve all the incumbent stakeholders from the very beginning in order to have a complete set of inputs for the later stages of the policy formulation. In Colombia, many ministries, agencies, sectoral representatives, regulators, conformity assessment bodies, everyone, quality infrastructure representatives, and even international allies, UNIDO and others were present in the discussions and the elaboration process that later derived in responsibilities for all those actors, which accepted those responsibilities in an easier way that if they weren't engaged from the starting point. Taking into account different perspectives led, for example, to put into evidence that there were market information gaps that avoided the development of laboratory services in the country. In this regard, there were cases when companies thought that the required services were not available in the country and looked for them somewhere else. Meanwhile, national laboratories offering those services lacked the demand to make them economically sustainable. Thanks to that, the development of laboratory networks and the development of systems and search engines were contemplated to solve coordination gaps just from the laboratory policy. And just to mention a last lesson, a last one, but I'm sure that there are many other lessons, and not just in the development, but also in the implementation. I think it's very helpful to have a policy leader or a small group of leaders capable of coordinate efforts, balance interests, take decisions at the macro level, and promote institutional engagement. In Colombia, the National Planning Department, as the leaders of policy development in the country, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Tourism as coordinators of the National Quality Subsystem, and the National Metrology Institute also centralized many of the inputs and the definitions needed to draft the laboratory policy, and its role was highly relevant in order to ensure consensus and alignment among the many interested parties. I'm sure there are many other lessons, but because of the time, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Javier. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about your experience from the development in Colombia. Now, our next panelist is Ms. Paloma Elliotson. She's General Manager of Testing and Inspection at Namibia Standards Institution, and she'll give us the laboratory perspective. Obviously, that's the core of everything. Now, how can the laboratory policy assist the development of a laboratory association to more cost effectively address quality control issues, such as participation in PT, proficiency testing, or access to reference materials? The word is yours, Paloma.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, all. My appreciation to UNIDO for this invitation. The laboratory policy provides a tool whereby a country through stakeholders can bring national coherence for a fit-for-purpose laboratory infrastructure, and it sets the framework for how the country can recognize and build onto existing laboratory infrastructure and set new objectives for future development. Laboratory associations can play a key role in the awareness raising, promotion, and coordination of the practical aspects of quality for laboratories. Reference materials and interlaboratory comparison schemes being critical tools to demonstrate reliability and accuracy of laboratories. The laboratory policy can guide a process through information gathering in the form of a needs assessment, which forms the basis of a stakeholder analysis and agreement on national needs, establishing national coherence. Practically, the Laboratory Association is a good platform to coordinate such a need analysis. Now, a gap analysis done by the SADC Laboratory Associations under the UNIDO SADC Regional Lab Association SQIS project showed that laboratories still found sustainable and affordable access to interlaboratory comparisons, namely ILCs and reference material, to be key challenges. Also highlighted was the challenge of courier logistics of reference materials across borders into many SADC countries. Now, several laboratory associations belonging to the SRLA have successfully launched interlaboratory comparison schemes based on these national needs analysis. Examples include the ASCO lab of the DRC, the NLAN South Africa, the NLAE of Eswatini, to name but a few of the many success stories. By setting up of these schemes, the people involved expanded their knowledge and understanding of the testing and calibrations conducted, which is of great benefit to the country as a whole. As the association procures in bulk, it can also access better pricing, save on forex, and can organize distribution of the reference materials used for ILCs and for reference material from within the country, which can improve affordability and accessibility for participation for many laboratories, big or small. The association can thus increase its sustainability while responding to the needs of its members. Now, COVID-19 brought us many challenges, but it also created opportunities for large groups to meet and discuss, as we are doing today, through affordable video conferencing solutions. A report of the SADC Water Lab LC scheme highlighted that a key need of training for laboratories to perform corrective action on the interlaboratory comparisons out of specification results still remain. Furthermore, ILC data can be used to benefit the laboratory, for example, as part of its competency evaluations and to benefit and enrich its validation studies. Laboratory associations can then use this technology to bring participants together to discuss the results of LICs and reference material usage to increase understanding of the results and to build onto the benefits drawn by the laboratories from this participation. Platforms where experience can be shared is a powerful tool to increase the benefits to all, thereby capacitating labs to pool these technical competencies established through ILCs through to routine testing. The association is a good representation as a voice for laboratories, both to government and to the international community. When it represents the national needs, it can access resources for its members that one single laboratory will not have access to. Now, I will be amiss if I don't share the success stories on the African continent of the SADC Water Lab ILC scheme, as well as the African Food Safety Network in development of ILC competency on the continent specific to the African and regional needs. The adoption of laboratory policies create this enabling environment within which laboratory associations can draw benefit for its members. Now, in the context of Africa, and specifically my own country, Namibia, I'm proud to say that the Namibian government recently endorsed a reviewed national quality policy and thereby emphasized its commitment and focus on quality infrastructure. The policy was formally launched this morning in Namibia. And through this National Laboratory Association and its role as a coordinator for national quality issues in laboratories was again highlighted as a strategic goal of the national quality policy. In conclusion, Madam, when a laboratory association focuses on the national needs of the laboratory community, its relevance is established, its sustainability is improved through offering services that are relevant and address national coherence while building on inclusivity and integrity of the national laboratory infrastructure. In this manner, the laboratory policy objectives can be realized. On behalf of the National Laboratory Association of Namibia, I express my appreciation to UNIDO for the leadership role and visionary approach that has benefited the region through this project, and I commend the new initiative launched today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Another success story. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Devin McDaniels, Economic Affairs Officer from the World Trade Organization, WTO. Now, Devin, we know that trade makes economies tick. And the question would be, how can a laboratory policy unlock trade opportunities? And what would the role of WTO be in that respect? The word is yours, Devin.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here indeed. Let me first say congratulations to Bernardo, Juan Pablo, and the whole UNIDO team for the launch of this very valuable laboratory policy guide. I think it's going to be very useful indeed for all stakeholders. So in response to your question, I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is really on the centrality of laboratory infrastructure, laboratory policy in improving the lives of people. The second point is going to be about what's the WTO role in this and how we contribute. And then the last point will be a call for working even more closely together, even more better cooperation than we have today. Because I think we can set our sights even higher. So I think, first of all, when we look at laboratory policy and infrastructure, it's clear that this has a clear and important link with actually improving the lives of ordinary people. So we know that meeting quality requirements is one of the major bottlenecks that's actually preventing entrepreneurs in lower income countries from tapping into opportunities presented by international trade. And it's often a lack of internationally recognized quality and lab infrastructure, which can lead to compliance problems, weak competitiveness, and actually undermines confidence in the product that's being traded. So when we can get these quality infrastructure issues sorted out and organized in a coherent manner, this really allows countries to reap the benefits of trade as an engine of growth, inclusiveness, and poverty reduction in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is really just about changing people's lives, raising incomes and standards of living. So I think we need to keep this really vital goal in mind, and that's why this work on infrastructure laboratory policy is so important. Just to give you some examples, the WTO, through our Standards and Trade Development Facility, together with partners like UNIDO, or for example, supporting Nigerian women to sell shea butter to the US or UK market, or Cameroonian entrepreneurs to sell penja pepper in Europe. And the key to unlocking these trade opportunities is really meeting the quality and safety requirements, and that's backed up by the right infrastructure. So I think when we look at the document, we see that laboratory policy can really help countries set the right path in the development of their quality infrastructure and focus investments and competencies for those priority sectors to allow them to actually integrate into regional and global value chains. I think, of course, though, we need to keep in mind that lab infrastructure goes much further than trade. And it's the technical basis for actually keeping people and the environment safe and healthy, and is actually linked to the biggest threats we face today. So the pandemic has brought home the centrality and the central role of quality institutions and labs for manufacturing and accessing safe and quality vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. We're also holding this discussion the day after Earth Day. And we know that, to quote Bill Gates, solving COVID is easy compared to climate change. And I think the needs for trusted measurement of carbon emissions embedded in products are only going to increase as we raise our climate ambition. So turning to my second point, what is the WTO role in this? And if you look at the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, this is really, the role of WTO is really all about helping ordinary people to improve living standards, to create jobs, to support sustainability. And if we zoom in a bit more on the TBT agreement, that's really the WTO agreement, which is trying to further these objectives through development of international standards and actually quality infrastructure to facilitate trade. And so how does this work in practice? In essence, I think we can think about the WTO as providing a structure and push for the international recognition of laboratory and quality infrastructure. So it does this by encouraging the use and adoption of relevant international standards, guides, and recommendations as the basis for our 164 member governments, technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures. The WTO also does this by explicitly encouraging the recognition and acceptance of conformity assessment results between our members on the basis of accreditation or other mechanisms. And of course, international and regional systems for conformity assessment are also encouraged. So all the institutions that are represented here today and the INET-QI group, they're all making this happen, of course, in the areas of metrology, accreditation, standards, and conformity assessment. And all of your vital work is actually enabling trade to flow smoothly. I think that's, but of course, the WTO system also helps in ways like improving transparency on these measures that are taken and giving space to discuss and resolve problems that can arise. My third point is on cooperation. And I think we can actually set our sights on being even stronger in terms of how we cooperate. We know that there is great demand out there for technical assistance and investment for laboratory and quality infrastructure. And there are many organizations and donors that are active in this space, often operating in the same countries at the same time. And I think coordination is a challenge. So just in our work, when we at the WTO are trying to organize technical cooperation activities with our members, we find it very difficult to get a clear picture of what's happening in a country, what project and support is actually going on, and who's benefiting from what. So I think the QI organizations, a number of us are already working together very well through INET-QI. But I think if we want to help countries achieve the trade benefits of quality and laboratory infrastructure for their people, we can work even more closely and coherently together. And here, I think we could explore ways to increase and reinforce coordination of technical assistance provided by partner organizations for more effective implementation of the WTO TBT agreement and better quality infrastructure. So I think this needs to take place not just between the relevant organizations, but together with all interested WTO members and other organizations. And I think this can help us to identify needs, capacity building needs, gaps. We can share experiences, discuss best practices so that we can replicate and build out from these. And so I think with that, let me again wrap up and again congratulate UNIDO for the launch of this laboratory policy guide today. And we look forward to working together with you, with Bernardo, Juan Pablo, and all of our colleagues on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you very much. Now it's time for us to start the questions and answers session. But we have a person in the audience whom I think I would like to ask to just say a few words, a minute or so, or two maybe, on how laboratory policy and laboratory infrastructure contributes to legal metrology organizations. And that person is Ian Dunmill, who is also a director in the International Organization for Legal Metrology, OIML. Ian, would you like to say a few words about how this can contribute to legal metrology?
Just a second, it decided to rejoin me, so I'm just
okay.
Just having a small problem.
Okay, shall I take a question while you're
just
trying
take a question
to
while I'm sorting it out? Yes, please.
Okay, there is a question here from the audience, and that question has been around since I don't know when. And it's about how important is it for a government to separate the bodies that make standards to the ones that do the testing. And I'd like Christina to address that. Are you with us, Christina?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Would you like to say a few words about that, just very quickly?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so the development of international standards is based on several principles, and one of this principle is to involve the right stakeholders. And of course, what we use at the international level to develop standards is advocated also at the national level when we talk about the development of standards at national level, or when we talk about the input from the national level into the international standard development. So I would say that when we talk about development of standards, professionals from laboratories are a key stakeholder in the development of standards because they have the know-how, they understand how things are running in a laboratory, they understand what are the needs of the laboratory. So they are an important player when standards are developed, standards that are developed to be applied in laboratories. Now, when we think about standards, we think about voluntary documents. However, we all know that many of these standards become mandatory because they are included in regulations. So I do not see a problem of having, there is no problem of having laboratory professionals and people working in laboratories contributing to the development of standards, as long as this development is made with people coming from other horizons. So this is why it's so important in the international development of standards to maintain a balanced representation and to have the right stakeholders at the table. In terms of how regulations are developed, this is a completely different aspect, and there are each country, they have their own way of developing.
Yes.
Of course, there are international principles and good practices, and many of the trade agreements, and David talk about that, they contain chapters related to good laboratory practices.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Christina. So in your view, I think you answered the core question. So I'll cut it here and let Ian come in and give us his view on how the laboratory policy can contribute to legal metrology. Please, Ian.
Thank you. Sorry about the small technical problem there. Something strange happened when I got promoted, so to speak. Firstly, just in case anyone's in the audience is wondering, legal metrology is the application of regulation to metrology, or maybe vice versa, the application of metrology in regulations. So it covers measuring instruments and measurements used in a wide variety of areas, such as trade, where it historically originated from, but now also covers measurements taken in health, safety, environmental measurement, or in other cases where legal proof of measurement is required, such as during a court case. So the instruments, the measuring instruments that are used are then subject to various legal control processes, such as type approval, verification, and inspection in use. And each of those activities requires government authorities or bodies that they authorize to make use of accredited laboratories, as well as equipment that's regularly calibrated in a traceable way. Manufacturers can also supply their own test results in some cases to legal metrology authorities, and the same conditions would then apply to them, whether they're from their own laboratories or private laboratories that they make use of. So all of those steps, therefore, rely on an unbroken traceability chain from the international standards, the international system of units, right down through the national standards and working standards, down to what might typically be direct trade with a consumer over a measuring instrument such as a weighing scale in a shop or an electricity meter in their home. And therefore this publication, in my opinion, will help enormously in guiding the laboratories, regulators and policymakers in ensuring that the chain is effectively established and then maintained through the use of a coherent national policy for the framework of the laboratory infrastructure. In that way, the governments themselves can be comfortable that their own consumers are able to have more confidence in the measurements that might affect them, whether they're in their daily shopping, their medical treatments, which is obviously very important to all of us now, but also safety, whether it's at work, on the road, or considering pollution in the environment. And as Devin just said, that's also very highly topical since we had the Earth Day yesterday. So all of those things require that national policy, which I think this government, this document will be very, very valuable in helping governments to establish. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very concise and to the point. Thank you so much. Now, there are a couple of more questions here, and two of them, I think, sort of stick out as being requiring a quick answer. One of them is, what is the socioeconomic impact of laboratory policy to private laboratories? Now, it also says which are not accredited, but let's forget about accreditation. And I think I would like to forward this question to Mike, because he and I exchanged a few words around that, about how private laboratories would benefit from this, and Mike has a very good answer. So Mike Pete, please, would you like to contribute? That doesn't help, Mike.
I'm trying to start my video. Sorry,
okay.
I unblocked my microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Yeah, in our discussions about this, we mentioned the fact that really the policy as an initial activity is really helping countries that are seeking outside donor assistance. And in my experience with quality policy and quality infrastructure, the private sector are very, very adept at meeting their needs and will certainly investigate private sector laboratories either in the country or in other countries as well. So I think what this policy does is help focus, first of all, to get the country to understand its market-driven needs, and from there to really see how the private sector can assist, noting the fact that it's got to be sustainable. We can't really, and we know also from experience then, that will only then really focus them on certain areas of testing and calibration that are sustainable. And there is still then a huge need for the public sector facilities then to cope with the other trade or health and safety needs. So, I mean, that would be my very short intervention.
Thank you. The next question, which I think we shouldn't leave unanswered, but we need a very short answer to that, It's how can the lab policy contribute to sustainability and the transition to circular economy? And I think the answer to that should come from UNIDO. I don't know whether Juan Pablo or Bernardo would like to respond. You can have a silent fight between the two of you and come up with who's going to answer. Are you with us at all? I don't see them.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. I think that it is a very important question. And if we look at the laboratory policy, it's an integral part of the quality policy. And we see as an integral part of the quality policy how the impact of the quality policy is to circular economy. And with the circular economy needs measurements to really take the necessary measures to evaluate whether the products that are being used or recycled in the circular economy really conform and are up to the needs that those next use, reuse, recycle of the products within the circular economy are fit for purpose. So this is in a way how the laboratory policy as part of the quality policy are contributing to the circular economy. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Now, with that, I think I'll have to close the panel and the questions and answers because we're running out of time. But I think this has been very constructive, and I'll give the word to Dorina. Dorina, now you're the boss.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you very much to all the panelists for having been here with us today. We're sorry, we got a lot of questions through the chat. We tried to answer most of them, either live or in writing. We're sorry, we're running out of time. We will not be able to answer all of them live. I'd like to remind you that all the documents and the recordings will be made available afterwards for you to rewatch on the UNIDO Knowledge Hub, hub.unido.org. All relevant links can also be found in the chat. And having said that, I'd like to give now the floor to my colleague, Juan Pablo Davila, who is an Industrial Development Officer at UNIDO, for his closing remarks. Juan Pablo, please.
Thank you, Dorina. Well, I will be very brief. It would be very hard for me to consolidate all the interactions in a couple of minutes. I first would like to thank the participants for taking the time to attend. We had a very large attendees in Zoom, and also we had broadcasted in YouTube. And primarily also thank all the contributors to this document for their time to go through the document through all the iterations that we had. And finally, and not the least, to the panelists that are here with us. The quality policy, it is a document that, as you have seen, tries to look at the ecosystem of laboratory, and the ecosystem has different actors in this ecosystem, which are part of the quality policy. These actors interact between them with different services and products. And as mentioned at the beginning, we look at the supply and demand, not only on the supply of the laboratory, but the supply and demand between all these actors of these different services and products that they interact to make a functioning ecosystem for testing and for laboratories. Now, you have seen in the last year how testing has become very, very important. We cannot neglect that testing is at the highest of, regarded as the highest activity nowadays. Countries and the world are developing their policies, their strategies against COVID based on testing. If the testing is wrong, the policies, the strategies may be wrong, will be wrong. So this is how the importance and how we develop this in parallel, not knowing what was going to come, because I guess nobody knew 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, what it was going to come. But this is at the heart of the matter now. And it is not only, as mentioned, for medical services, it is also for environmental. We cannot take measures to improve climate change if we don't have reliable data. And this is the importance of having the ecosystem functioning. So the analysts and the results for whatever we want to measure are accurately and are comparable in the world. With this, thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Dorina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. And one more time, thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you, Mary, for the wonderful moderation. Thank you, Mike, for your very interesting presentation. And thank you, of course, to all the attendees for following us today. We're pleased that all of you were here with us, and I would herewith like to close the session for today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.